There is a moment, in the final hours before a civilization collapses, when no one inside it knows it is happening. The soldiers are laughing, the officers are confident, the king himself believes the hardest part is already over, and in a sense, he is right. The hardest part is over. The problem is that he survived the easy part and confused it for the war itself. On the night of October 13th, 1066, the English army of King Harold Godwinson sat on a ridge called Senlac Hill, 7 miles from Hastings, and drank. They sang. They passed cups of mead between men who had already done the impossible, who had marched 300 miles in less than a week, who had crushed an invasion in the north, who now looked across a valley at an enemy they outnumbered and believed, with every fiber of exhausted certainty, that they had already won. By the time the sun came up, most of them would be dead, and the reason they were dead had nothing to do with the Normans' skill on the battlefield. It had everything to do with what happened the night before, and the 18 days that led up to it. This is not a story about a battle. It is a story about a man who won too fast, celebrated too early, and handed an entire kingdom to a stranger because he could not make himself wait. If you want more deep dives like this is exactly what Chronicles Beyond History is built for. You are in the right place. The year 1066 began the way most years in medieval England did, quietly and with a death. King Edward the Confessor, the reigning monarch of England, died on January 5th without a single heir. He left behind a throne, a crown, and a country, and absolutely no clear answer for who was supposed to sit in all three. What followed was not a succession, it was an auction, and the bidders did not use money. They used armies, ships, and the cold willingness to kill anyone who disagreed. There were 4 men who believed the throne was theirs. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, the most powerful nobleman in England, a man who had effectively run the country for years while Edward aged into irrelevance. Edgar Etheling, a young prince with royal blood but no real power. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, a warrior so brutal that his own name translated roughly to hard ruler, a man who had spent decades carving his way across the North Sea with fire and iron. And William, Duke of Normandy, a man from across the English Channel, who claimed that the dead king had personally promised him the throne, and who had spent the better part of a year assembling the largest invasion fleet Europe had seen in a generation. Harold moved first. Within a single day of Edward's funeral, he stood in Westminster Abbey and was crowned King of England. Fast, decisive, the kind of move that tells every rival in the room, this throne is taken. The Witenagemot, the assembly of lords and bishops who formally chose English kings, backed him. He was the richest man in the country, the most powerful nobleman alive, and the man who had been running England in practice for years, while Edward retreated into prayer and church building. If anyone had a legitimate claim to the throne based on ability, on influence, on the simple fact of being present and capable, it was Harold. But legitimacy, in the 11th century, was a word with many meanings, and 2 of the men who disagreed with Harold's definition of it were already building ships. The trap Harold walked into was not one trap, it was 2, and they were closing from opposite directions at the same time, and he could only look at one of them. From the north came Harold Hardrada. The Norwegian king had spent the summer assembling a fleet that stretched across the horizon, somewhere between 200 and 300 long ships, carrying anywhere from 7,000 to 11,000 warriors. These were not farmers with spears. These were professional raiders, men who had spent generations learning the art of crossing open water and taking what they wanted when they arrived. And Hardrada had not come alone. He brought with him Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother. Tostig had been stripped of his earldom the year before, exiled by his own family, and he had spent every day since that exile plotting how to get it back. Allying with Hardrada was the logical move. It was also a betrayal, so personal that it turned a political dispute into something closer to a civil war. From the south came William of Normandy. The Duke had been preparing his invasion since the spring. He had the ships, hundreds of them, built from Norman oak, assembled along the coast of northern France near Saint-Valery-sous-Somme. He had the soldiers, a disciplined, well-equipped army built around mounted cavalry, something England had almost nothing to match. Norman knights were not the raiders who had terrorized Europe a century earlier. They were professionals, trained from adolescence in the art of mounted warfare, men who could fight from horseback with a level of coordination and tactical flexibility that Anglo-Saxon infantry simply could not replicate. He had the patience to wait for the right wind, the right moment, the right gap in Harold's attention, and he had something else, something that mattered enormously in the politics of medieval Europe. He had the blessing of the Pope. A papal banner flew over his fleet. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, William's war was righteous. Harold's defense of his throne was not. This was not a minor detail. It was a political weapon. To fight against a Pope-blessed invasion was, in the theology of the age, to fight against the expressed will of God. Every lord in England understood what that meant, and it meant that even if Harold won every battle, he was fighting a war in which the moral authority was not on his side. Harold understood clearly that he was being squeezed from two directions at once. He spent the summer in the south, watching the Channel, waiting for William to cross. He kept his navy on high alert, a fleet of ships positioned along the coast, ready to intercept the moment the Norman sails appeared on the horizon. He kept his army assembled, which was expensive and difficult because the men of the Fyrd, the part-time militia that formed the bulk of England's fighting force, had already been in the field for over 3 months. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, free men who owed their king 2 months of military service per year and who had already exceeded that obligation. By September, the harvest was coming. The fields needed tending or the food supply would fail. Men needed to go home to their families or their wives and children would face a winter without enough to eat. Harold let them go. He had no legal right to keep them and no moral authority to ask them to stay. He kept his household guard, the housecarls, about 2,000 of the best trained, most heavily armed soldiers in northern Europe, and he kept a skeleton force along the coast, and he waited. And then the weather turned. The winds that had been keeping William's fleet pinned on the French coast began to shift. Harold's naval scouts, who had been watching the Strait of Dover for weeks, dispersed. The fleet broke up and went home because there was nothing left to watch for. William had not come. It seemed, for a brief and dangerous moment, like the threat from the south was fading. Harold returned to London. He had been on a war footing for months. He had held the country together through sheer force of will, kept the army in the field, watched the horizon every single day, and nothing had happened. The storm had not come, not yet. That was the moment. That was the exact sliver of time when everything was about to break. On September 20th, 1066, Harold Hardrada's Viking army destroyed the English forces at the Battle of Fulford, just outside York. The two earls who had been holding the north, Edwin and Morcar, were routed. Their men were scattered, drowned in ditches, cut down on the retreat. York, the second most important city in England, surrendered without a fight. Hardrada owned the north, and Harold, who was in London when the news arrived, understood immediately what it meant. If he did not go north and crush this invasion personally, Norway would own England by winter. So he went, and he went fast. Harold assembled every housecarl he could gather, called in every thegn within riding distance, and began marching north along the old Roman road called Watling Street. The distance from London to York was roughly 200 miles. Harold covered it in 4 days. 4 days, that is 50 miles a day, through autumn weather, on roads that were barely roads at all, with an army that had already been exhausted from months of standing watch. The speed of it shocked everyone, including the Vikings, who had no idea Harold was coming until they saw him. On September 25th, Harold's army appeared at Stamford Bridge, a crossing point on the River Derwent, 7 miles east of York. Hardrada's men were not expecting a fight. A third of the Viking force had been left back at the ships at Rickwell. Many of the warriors at Stamford Bridge had left their armor and weapons behind. It was a hot day. They were relaxed, confident, waiting to receive hostages from York as part of the surrender agreement. And then Harold's army came over the hill, and the world shifted. Before the fighting began, Harold sent a messenger across the bridge. The messenger found Tostig in the Viking ranks and delivered a message from the king, peace, and the full restoration of his earldom in Northumbria. Everything Tostig had lost, everything he had been exiled for. Harold was offering his brother a way back, even now, even here, with an army behind him and a sword in his hand. Tostig asked what Harold would offer Harold Hardrada. The messenger replied with the now famous answer that has been repeated for 1,000 years: 7 feet of English soil, or since Hardrada was known to be a tall man, 7 feet. Tostig refused the peace. He chose to fight beside Hardrada instead of returning to his brother. It was the last choice he would ever make. The battle that followed was decisive, brutal, and short. The fighting began on the bridge itself, where the Vikings attempted to hold the crossing against Harold's larger force. There is a story, passed down in the Norse sagas, of a single Viking warrior who held the bridge alone against Harold's entire army, cutting down wave after wave of English soldiers with a massive axe, until someone finally stabbed him from below through the planks of the bridge with a long spear. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the image is true to the spirit of what occurred. The Vikings fought with everything they had, and it was not enough. Harold Hardrada was killed by an arrow in the throat. Tostig died fighting beside him. Of the 200 or more ships that had sailed from Norway, only 24 made it home. Harold had won, completely, devastatingly, without question. He had crushed a full-scale Viking invasion in a single afternoon and killed 2 of his enemies in the process, one of them his own blood. By any measure of medieval kingship, it was a triumph. The kind of victory that songs are written about, the kind of victory that fills a man with the absolute certainty that he is destined to rule. And that certainty was the first nail in England's coffin. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, 3 days, the news arrived. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex on September 28th. 700 ships, thousands of soldiers. The invasion Harold had been watching for all summer had come, and it had come at the exact moment when Harold was 300 miles away in the north, with an army that had just fought a major battle and was in no condition to fight another. Harold's brother Gurth, one of his most trusted advisors, made the obvious suggestion. "Let me lead the army south," Gurth said. "You are the king. You cannot risk your life in another battle. Stay in London. Gather reinforcements. Let me fight William, and if I lose, you will still be alive to rally the country." It was sound advice. It was, by almost every strategic measure, the correct advice. Harold rejected it without hesitation. He would go himself. He would march south immediately. He would meet William at Hastings and crush him the same way he had crushed Hardrada, fast, hard, and before the enemy had time to settle in. The logic, as Harold understood it, was simple. Speed had worked once. It would work again. Surprise had broken the Vikings. It would break the Normans. He was Harold Godwinson, King of England, the man who had just ended the Viking Age in a single afternoon. No duke from across the Channel was going to take what he had built. And there was something else, something deeper than strategy, something closer to temperament. Harold was a man who moved, who acted, who filled a room and filled a battlefield with the force of his own forward motion. Waiting was not something he knew how to do. Waiting was not something he had ever needed to do. The man who had carried England this far had done it by being faster, harder, more relentless than anyone around him. And that same quality, that refusal to slow down, was the thing that was going to kill him. This is where it broke, not in a single moment, not in one catastrophic decision. It broke in layers, the way a bone breaks when you put weight on it day after day, not from one blow, but from the accumulation of everything that came before. Harold's mistake was not going south. He had to go south. His mistake was the way he went, and what he brought with him and what he left behind. He left the northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, the very men whose armies had been destroyed at Fulford, in the north. They were supposed to gather reinforcements and march south to join him. Harold did not wait for them. He did not wait for anyone. He assembled the surviving housecarls from Stamford Bridge, men who had just fought a bloody battle 5 days earlier, gathered what ferd he could find along the road south, and began marching again. Another 200 miles, another forced march, this time in the opposite direction, with soldiers who were already running on fumes. Harold moved so fast that many of his own troops could not keep up with him. He arrived in London ahead of parts of his own army, and he spent a week there, gathering forces, trying to assemble something resembling a full war host. But the men he needed most were not there. The fired who had been released in September, the farmers, the labourers, the backbone of any English war force, were already back at their homesteads. The harvest was underway. Calling them back meant abandoning their crops, which meant their families might not eat through the winter. Some answered the summons, many did not. Harold ended up with a force that was smaller than what he had fought with at Stamford Bridge, and infinitely more tired. Edwin and Morcar never arrived with their northern reinforcements in time. Harold could not wait for them. Every day he waited was another day William spent organizing, foraging, building a fortified position on the Sussex coast. The longer Harold delayed, the stronger William became. The hidden vulnerability was not in numbers, it was in the men themselves. The housecarls who formed the front line of Harold's shield wall, the men who were supposed to be the most dangerous soldiers in Europe, had marched over 400 miles in less than 3 weeks, fought a full-scale battle, and were now about to fight another. They had eaten whatever they could carry, or forage along the way. They had slept in snatches, on the road while still moving. Their bodies were not broken exactly, they were just emptied out, the kind of tired that does not go away with a night's sleep, the kind of tired that lives in your legs, your arms, the part of your brain that is supposed to make you react when something unexpected happens, the kind of tired that turns the best soldiers in the world into men who are standing in the right formation but cannot quite remember why. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Battles like this were shaping the lives of people across an entire continent at the same time, and most of them had no idea any of it was happening. Harold arrived at Senlac Hill on the night of October 13th. He had chosen the position well, a long ridge that stretched across the only road between Hastings and London, with marshy ground protecting his flanks on both sides, and the great forest of the Weald at his back. To the south, the ground fell away in a long, gradual slope toward the valley below, where it rose again as Telham Hill. It was a textbook defensive position, difficult ground for cavalry to charge across, difficult ground for archers to shoot uphill, a narrow front that required far fewer defenders than attackers. If Harold could hold this hill, William could not pass. If William could not pass, he could not reach London. If he could not reach London, he could not be crowned. The geography was on Harold's side. The ground was on Harold's side. All he had to do was hold. And on the night before the battle, according to the chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing within a generation of the events, the English camp did not behave. Like an army on the eve of a desperate fight, Malmesbury recorded that the English passed the night without sleep, in drinking and singing. This was not a secret. It was not a rumor buried in a single obscure source. It was written down by multiple chroniclers, and it was understood at the time as a statement about the English army's state of mind, and about English culture more broadly. Malmesbury himself noted that drinking in parties was a common English habit, that they passed entire nights in it, as well as days, and that the vices that came with drunkenness had in his telling doomed the country. Whether or not Malmesbury was being fair to the English, he was writing in Norman England after all, and had reasons to paint the conquered people as reckless. The basic fact remains: the English camp on the night of October 13th was loud, celebratory, and loose. They had just won. They had crushed an invasion. They were on good ground. They were confident, and so they drank, and they sang, and they told each other stories about Stamford Bridge, and they went into the morning of October 14th with their heads heavy and their bodies hollowed out by weeks of marching and fighting and not sleeping. Across the valley, on Telham Hill, William's Normans passed the same night differently. William of Jumièges recorded that the Duke kept his entire army armed and ready for a possible surprise attack through the entire night, not sleeping, not relaxing, not celebrating anything. The Norman chronicler William of Poitiers wrote that the Normans spent the night in prayer, confessing their sins and receiving the sacrament. They understood, in a way the English apparently did not, that the battle had not yet been fought. That confidence on the eve of war was not the same as safety, that the men who survived tomorrow were not necessarily the men who felt the most secure tonight. They were treating the next morning the way soldiers treat a day that might be the last one they ever see. The contrast is almost absurd in its clarity. Two armies camped within sight of each other on opposite hills, spending the same night in two completely different ways. One celebrating a victory that had not yet happened, the other preparing for a fight they knew would be the hardest of their lives. At 9 in the morning on Saturday, October 14th, 1066, the battle began. The first phase was impact, and it favored Harold. William's army descended from Telham Hill and formed up in the valley below Senlac Ridge. The Normans had a mixed force, archers in the front ranks, infantry behind them, and cavalry on the wings. It was a sophisticated army built around the interplay of ranged fire, mounted shock, and infantry discipline. But none of that mattered in the first hour, because the English shield wall was holding. The shield wall was England's great weapon. Rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping like the scales of a fish, spears and axes angled outward. It was a formation that had been perfected over centuries of defending against Viking raids, and it was nearly impossible to break head-on, especially on high ground. The Norman archers fired uphill, and most of their arrows sailed over the English line or punched harmlessly into the thick wooden shields. The Norman infantry charged uphill into a wall of interlocking shields and swinging battle-axes, and the housecarls met them with a ferocity that made the Normans flinch. A single housecarl wielding a Danish axe, a massive two-handed weapon with a blade wide enough to split a man from shoulder to hip, could cut through an armored Norman knight and his horse in a single swing. The sound of it carried across the battlefield. The Normans came and the English held, and the slope in front of Senlac Ridge became slick with blood. Wave after wave, the Normans came, and wave after wave they broke against the ridge. For 2 hours, the battle was a stalemate. Harold's position was strong, his men were disciplined, the ground was doing most of the work for him. And then, around mid-morning, everything that the English confidence had been built on began very quietly to crack. The second phase was stalemate, and it was where the exhaustion started to show. William's initial assault had failed, and the Norman army pulled back to regroup. During this pause, something happened that no one on the English ridge had expected. A rumor swept through the Norman ranks that William himself had been killed, that a Saxon axe had found him somewhere in the chaos of the first assault. The rumor was false, but it was believed, and sections of the Norman cavalry began to retreat in what was, at that moment, genuine panic. They were not faking it, they were running, and here is where the English made their first mistake. Some of the English soldiers on the left and right, edges of the shield wall, mostly feared men, not the hardened housecarls at the center, broke formation and charged after the retreating Normans. They ran down the hill. They ran because they thought they were winning. They ran because the enemy was fleeing. They ran because they were tired. And tired men do not think the way rested men think. The pursuit was natural, instinctive, the kind of thing that happens when soldiers believe the fight is already decided. William saw what happened. He rode through his men, lifted his helmet to show his face, and proved he was alive. The panic subsided. The Norman cavalry rallied. William turned his horse back toward the ridge, and the men who had been fleeing moments before followed him. And the English soldiers, who had left the shield wall, exposed on flat ground, separated from their line, were surrounded. They tried to form a small defensive circle on a hillock below the main battle line, but they were outnumbered, and many of them wore no chainmail, almost certainly meaning they were fired men, not trained housecarls. The Norman cavalrymen used their height advantage to slash down onto the English from above, and with no support from the rest of the army, the small circle was cut apart within minutes. The men on the ridge watched it happen. They watched men they had been standing beside an hour earlier die on a piece of ground 200 yards away, and they could do nothing about it. The effect was worse than any wound. It was the moment when confidence began to taste like ash. The shield wall had not broken, not yet, but it had shrunk. The men who had run down the hill were gone, and they could not be replaced. The ridge was a little thinner, the line was a little shorter. The battle had been going for roughly 2 hours, longer than most medieval engagements lasted in total. Both sides were bloodied, exhausted, and looking for a way to change the math. For the English, the math was simple: hold the line, and time was on their side. For William, the math was equally simple. The shield wall would not break by force alone. Something else was needed. The third phase was the shift, and it was where William became something more than a competent commander. William had spent the morning trying to break the shield wall by force. It had not worked. The ground was too steep, the English were too disciplined, and the Norman weapons could not penetrate the overlapping shields at range. So he changed the equation entirely. He ordered his cavalry to attack again, but this time, when the English resistance stiffened, the cavalry was to fall back. Not in panic, not randomly, deliberately, controlled, a feigned retreat. The Norman horsemen would charge the shield wall, engage for a short time, and then wheel away as though they had been broken. They would ride back down the hill as though they were fleeing, and they would watch, as they rode, to see which parts of the English line would follow. This was not a simple trick. It required extraordinary discipline. The discipline to pretend to run away while an enemy with battle axes is right behind you, and then to turn, on signal, and attack the men who had just been chasing you. It was a tactic the Normans had used before in France, and they were practiced at it. The English, fighting for the first time against this kind of coordinated deception, were not. The feigned retreat worked. Again, sections of the English line broke formation to pursue. Again, they were cut down when the cavalry turned. And here is the thing that made it so devastating. Each time it happened, it was not the same soldiers who broke ranks. The first pursuit had pulled men off the western edge of the ridge. The second pulled men from another section. Each feigned retreat targeted a different part of the shield wall, peeling it apart like skin from a wound, one strip at a time. William used the tactic at least twice more over the course of the afternoon, each time drawing more English soldiers off the ridge, each time thinning the shield wall by another irreplaceable handful of men. The Normans did not need to break the wall in one assault. They just needed to make it smaller and smaller and smaller until there was not enough left to hold. The psychological effect was as important as the physical one. Every time the Norman cavalry charged and the English held, the men on the ridge felt a flicker of something, not quite hope, but its cousin, the belief that they were doing the right thing, that the line was working, that discipline was winning. And every time a section of the English broke formation and chased the retreating Normans, and those men never came back, the belief flickered. The soldiers still standing began to notice the gaps. They began to feel the ridge shrinking beneath their feet. The ground in front of the English position became littered with bodies, English and Norman alike, and the men still standing on the ridge began to see, in the faces of the men around them, something that looked less like confidence and more like the slow, creeping recognition that this fight was not going the way it was supposed to go. The fourth phase was collapse, and it happened in the space of an hour. By late afternoon, the shield wall had been grinding down for nearly 8 hours. The men at the front, the housecarls, the best soldiers England had, were being replaced one by furred men, farmers, labourers, men who carried iron-studded clubs and hay forks instead of axes and swords, men who wore padded leather instead of chainmail. They were brave, they held their ground, but they were not housecarls, and William's cavalry could tell the difference. The shield wall was shrinking visibly now, contracting inward along the ridge as the edges collapsed, each section thinner than the eye. Last, the men still standing growing tighter together as they tried to maintain a line that was running out of men to fill it. The Norman archers, who had been firing uphill all day with limited effect, were ordered to change their angle. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they fired high, lobbing their arrows in a steep arc so that the points came down almost vertically, dropping over the tops of the English shields and striking the men behind the front line. Men who had been standing untouched for hours suddenly found arrows in their shoulders, their necks, their faces. The line buckled. Men stepped back. The shield wall, which had held for the better part of a day, began to physically come apart, not breaking cleanly but dissolving. the way a wall of sand dissolves when the water reaches it, and then Harold was hit. The exact circumstances of his death remain one of the most debated questions in English history. The most famous version, that he was struck in the eye by an arrow, comes from the Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter-long embroidered account of the conquest created within years of the battle. Whether it was an arrow or a sword or a spear, the chroniclers agree on the essential fact. Harold Godwinson, King of England, died on Senlac Hill on the afternoon of October 14, 1066. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine, who had been fighting beside him, were killed in the same final assault. The three most powerful men in England were dead before sunset. The fifth phase was desperation, and it lasted only minutes. Harold's death did not end the battle instantly. The surviving housecarls and what was left of them kept fighting. The war cry of "Out, out, out" kept echoing across the ridge, shouted from throats that were raw and dry, growing quieter with each repetition as the men who shouted it fell. But the focus was gone. The center of the English army, the man who held it all together, the symbol that every soldier on that ridge was fighting for, was on the ground. The shield wall, already thin, already exhausted, already dying by inches, had no reason left to hold. William's cavalry came over the ridge one final time, and this time there was nothing to stop them. The English broke, not all at once and not without a fight. Some fled into the forest behind them, disappearing into the trees and the darkness that was closing in. Sunset that day was at 4:54 in the afternoon, and by 6, the battlefield was nearly dark. Some turned and fought, making small stands on small hills, and were cut down. A few survived, most did not. The ground between Senlac Hill and the tree line became, in the space of 30 minutes, the bloodiest patch of earth in English history. The battle had lasted from 9 in the morning until dusk, roughly 8 hours. 8 hours of continuous fighting, one of the longest single-day engagements in all of medieval warfare. And in that time, England had lost not just a battle, it had lost its king, its princes, the bulk of its aristocracy, and the entire military elite that had held the country together for generations. William of Normandy did not rush to London. He had won the battle, but he had not yet won the war, and he knew the difference. He spent the days after Hastings consolidating his position, securing his supply lines, and making sure the English understood that the fight was over. On Christmas Day, 1066, less than 11 weeks after the battle, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was interrupted by a riot in the nave, English soldiers protesting the occupation, and William had to draw his sword to restore order. It was, in its own way, a perfect summary of what had just happened. A new king, installed by force, in a country that had not asked for him. The transformation that followed was not gradual. It was systematic, deliberate, and total. William confiscated the lands of every English lord who had fought and died at Hastings and redistributed them to his Norman followers. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the class of men who had governed England for centuries, was wiped out in a single generation. By the time William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a comprehensive survey of every piece of land and every significant holding in England, the numbers told the story plainly. 90% of the population lived in the countryside. 75% of them were serfs, unfree laborers who worked land they did not own for lords they had never chosen, in a system that had not existed in England 20 years earlier. Almost no English lord of any significance still held land. The country's wealth, its titles, its power, all of it had moved into French hands. The language changed. Norman French became the language of the court, the law, and the aristocracy. The common people still spoke Old English, the Germanic tongue that had been the voice of England for 500 years. But the words that described power, wealth, governance, and war were now French words. The meat that the wealthy ate at banquet, beef, pork, were French words. The meat the poor ate, mutton, was English. The gap between the rulers and the ruled was written into the vocabulary itself, a divide you could hear every time someone opened their mouth. Over the next 2 centuries, Old English and Norman French would grind against each other like tectonic plates, and what emerged from the collision was something new, Middle English, and the language that Shakespeare would eventually write in, the language that the modern English-speaking world inherited, was born from that collision. A country Harold died to defend became, in its very tongue something he would not have recognized. The feudal system took root. William claimed that every piece of land in England belonged to him personally, and that every lord held his estate only as long as he provided military service to the crown. This was not how Anglo-Saxon England had worked. It was how Norman France worked, and William imposed it on an entire nation overnight. The result was a centralized hierarchical state that was, by the standards of the 11th century, remarkably efficient and remarkably brutal in enforcing its authority. When the north of England resisted Norman rule in 1069, William responded with what historians call the Harrying of the North, a scorched earth campaign across Yorkshire that burned villages, destroyed crops, and poisoned the land so thoroughly that parts of it did not recover for a generation. It was a message written in fire. This country belongs to us now, and anyone who disagrees will learn what that means. England, in other words, did not just lose a battle on October 14th, 1066. It lost a civilization, the Anglo-Saxon world, its language, its laws, its aristocracy, its way of organizing itself was replaced, root and branch, by something entirely foreign. And the reason it happened was not because the Normans were better soldiers. They were good. They were disciplined. They had better cavalry. But Harold's shield wall held for 8 hours against everything William threw at it. On another day, on a day when the English had rested, when they had not marched 400 miles in 3 weeks, when they had gone to sleep the night, before in silence instead of song, the shield wall might have held until dark, and William might have pulled back, and the course of history might have been completely, irreversibly different. The permanent pattern that Hastings reveals is not about cavalry versus infantry, or Normans versus Saxons, or even good tactics versus bad. It is about the relationship between confidence and vulnerability, the way that winning can make you forget, in the most dangerous way possible, how close you are to losing. Harold Godwinson was not a foolish man. He was not incompetent. He was, by every account, one of the most capable military leaders England had ever produced. He won at Stamford Bridge through speed, aggression, and sheer force of will, and every single one of those qualities, the speed, the aggression, the refusal to wait, was exactly the wrong set of instincts to bring to Hastings. He could have waited in London. He could have let Edwin and Morcar gather reinforcements from the north. He could have given his men a week to rest, to eat, to recover from what they had already done. He could have sent Gurth to fight in his place, as Gurth had offered, and kept himself alive to rally the country if the first battle went badly. He could have done a dozen things differently, and any one of them might have changed the outcome. But he did not, because the man who had just won the greatest victory of his life could not make himself slow down. The momentum of triumph carried him straight into the thing that destroyed him, and on the night before Hastings, his soldiers felt it too. They drank because they had won. They sang because they believed the war was already over. They went to sleep, or did not sleep at all, because confidence, when it is strong enough, feels exactly like safety. On the other side of the valley, William's men prayed because William understood something Harold had forgotten, that the battle had not happened yet, and that the men who won wars were not the men who celebrated first. They were the men who stayed awake. Chronicles Beyond History is about uncovering the stories behind power and collapse. The next chapter is already waiting.